James Ashton, how are you? Welcome to Podcast Radio.
Very well, Graham. Thanks. Good to be talking to you today.
Great podcast, Leading with James Ashton. It's all about leadership. Now, you're a columnist, a business writer, speaker, trainer. You were the city editor at the Evening Standard and the Sunday Times. You've written for the Daily Mail, the Independent, Reuters, loads of other publications. And you've produced hundreds of in-depth interviews featuring leaders from some of the world's biggest organizations. Before we talk about leadership and the podcast, let's find out more about you. Where did you grow up?
West Yorkshire. So I'm from Huddersfield.
Okay. And what kind of background then?
What would I say? A normal background. I think the thing I take most from the early years, Graham, is that my dad had a newspaper addiction. He was a two newspaper a day man. So and I think that rubbed off on me. He was morning and evening, and so there's a lot of newsprint in the house. So it felt when I thought about what I wanted to do for work, how do I get into newspapers? How do I get this ink on my fingers?
And what work was your dad in? Your parents?
My dad was in local government. He worked for many years looking after the markets. There's a big tradition of open markets and covered markets in the north of England, and he was there making sure people were on the right pitch, people were paying the fees, and by the afternoon he was generally out there having a good gossip with the stallholders.
And your mum?
She did some office work, but largely she stayed at home to look after us.
Right. And schooling, was it a posh school?
No, not at all. Not at all. It was the closest school in walking distance, Graham.
Yeah, same for me too. So that was
Yeah.
would that have been a comprehensive or a grammar school?
I think it was. I think towards the end of my time there, they've rebranded as a free grammar.
Right.
I think the emphasis was on the free, but it was it was a comprehensive. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you went to university?
Yeah, that's right. Now I went to St Andrews University in Scotland.
Right. And brothers and sisters, do you have any of them?
Yeah, I've got a younger brother who's
Yeah.
4 years younger called Jonathan.
Yeah. And did he get into the same trade as you?
Well, similar but different. He's gone. He didn't do the journalism. He's now in PR working in Dubai.
Oh, wow.
So he
Wow.
went a bit further away than I did in the end.
And paid a lot less tax, I'm guessing.
Well, that is very possibly the case, but I'm not sure where he's put all his ill-gotten gains. His mattress is very thin. Last time I went over there.
So you come out of university, you've got this passion for journalism. How did you get your start?
Well, you'd almost rewind before, before university. The thing, and it's interesting that we're talking about a podcast. The first bit of media I did was several years of hospital radio when I was
Really?
back at school, aged 16 and up. And that was a station called HWD that served Dewsbury District Hospital and surrounding area. Fantastic fun and a great group of people. And I went to university in St Andrews. The nearest radio station was TFM, Dundee, 2 bus rides away. And I went a few times, didn't have a car. And I thought, you know how lazy you get as soon as you become an undergraduate. I thought, this is a long way to go just to put someone else's records away. And so I committed myself to the student paper then, the Chronicle, and so that was me for university. And I think I must have spent as much time on the student paper as I did at the degree. But they've both come in handy in the years since.
So you were aiming towards media, but it just seemed that print media was a lot less work at the time than to broadcasting.
It was closer to home, I think. I mean, there was a suggestion that there might be a student radio station at some point in St Andrews, but I thought the paper was great because it was, unlike a lot of student papers, it wasn't attached to the student union. It was true independent student journalism. They had found a business model that worked. There were St Andrews was on the milk round, so the paper got a lot of the good advertising in for people like Procter and Gamble and PwC who wanted to hire on the milk round. So that sort of income plus the cover price actually was something that sustained them. So as a result, you could be a really opinionated. It was a really strong paper, and I thought, yeah, this is for me.
So your first professional gig, how did that go? Where was that?
Well, after St Andrews, I did a year at City University in London, which was the postgraduate in newspaper journalism, and which is a great year. You meet lots of people, you learn what you think you need to know, and then they also make you do shorthand every morning at 9 a.m., which does come in handy. You realise it comes in handy. They know what they're doing, and so my first job was at Reuters.
Right.
But on a desk, there were various specialist desks. So I joined one covering advertising and media. So, going into Soho and meeting a lot of the agencies and so on, and writing about that industry and consumer trends. So a good start.
That must have been really exciting, living in London, and you're in the environment. You're in the environment of where the big national newspapers are done.
Yeah, I think it was really exciting. I think it's quite a shock to the system. I had that shock to the system coming to do City. But if you think I'd been in a small town in Yorkshire, and then I'd been in an even smaller town in Scotland, and then it was straight to London. So yeah, that was quite a shock. But yeah, you realise you have to embrace it. You have to start building that network and meeting people and finding out how this industry works.
And how cutthroat was it back then? Because they were enormously powerful. Before the internet, the newspapers in this country were enormously powerful.
I think from going in through Reuters, I felt that there was more to life than what we would think of even today as the core Fleet Street titles.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they were cutthroat. I think there could be tough places to be. I mean, I had a short spell at a couple of them after Reuters, and there was sink or swim environments, and of course this is not the way that we're meant to learn these days. You're meant to be helped along and so on, but actually to flop at a few things can be quite helpful later on. Actually, that's something that leaders tell me on the podcast. I'm not always sure it's true, but I think it's great to be able to look back 20 years or so, Graham, and say, look, I totally mucked that up, but actually I was much better next time.
Do you think that kind of in at the deep end experience then it sounds like you think that was better than the way it is now, where everybody's mollycoddled a little bit?
There could be some in at the deep end now. Maybe we don't see it in where we're sat, but I think some of those things that I learned from getting it wrong. I mean, if I'm going in to interview somebody now, I will. It's like being a Cub Scout. Be prepared. Who are they? And before I did the podcast, I would interview, as you talked about in your kind intro, you interview these CEOs. You work hard to get into the room with them to get a level of trust. You've got your 50 minutes or 1 hour. So the worst thing you can do is turn up and go, so what do you do then? So I think that's, and I think it's so, rather than ask the CEO of Tesco, what does Tesco do? Dive in and go, well, why did this go wrong? Or tell me about your background or something. So I think it actually being unprepared early on has made me a lot more prepared in the later years, and making sure I don't waste their time and they're not wasting mine.
Can you be over prepared for an interview?
I think it's there's something I always try and avoid, which is the point maybe 10 minutes in when they realise I've done the equivalent of stalking them, and I think there's a key. I think you have to know everything, and then it's in your own mind as and when, if you reveal that that they're that their father went to university at X, or their third job after college was Y, or something. So I think it only looks like you're over prepared, I think, if it's disconcerting for them. I think it's helpful for them to know that it's not sort of a Jack and Jill interview or whatever you would call it. The interview will step up to a certain level. This guy knows what he's talking about. Therefore, I will give him, the slightly more involved and more interesting answer, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. And you've worked at a lot of British newspapers, and now you're doing a podcast about leadership. I've not worked in the newspaper game, but it does have a reputation for producing, shall we say, polarizing leaders, if you know what I'm saying. Did you find that?
Yeah, in parallel with the podcast, I wrote this book called The 9 Types of Leader. And the question that's come up when I've talked about the book in particular is, well, you've been in the newspaper game, James. which category do you put your editors in?
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that you've alluded to it, Graham, that the newspaper industry was perhaps a little bit more unreconstructed for longer than some other industries. And you have quite a tough white male environment. That's changed an awful lot, I think, say in the last 10 years. But I think of those leaders that you think of, those editors that, very, very strong and know their own mind, you probably would call them alpha leaders. But I think there is something really, really impressive about you haven't got much time to mess around in a newsroom, particularly if something's breaking, if you've got to rip things up, change the front, whatever. I think those editors that absolutely know their readers, they have great gut instincts. And yes, they're probably the people that will shout across the newsroom with some pretty fruity language. But some of those titles have done very, very well off the back of that over many years. I mean, the Daily Mail is a good example.
So are you saying that just because somebody appears to be difficult or abrasive, that doesn't necessarily make them a bad leader?
No, I think there's, the interesting thing about this alpha type, alpha is, it used to be everybody wanted to be an alpha, hence it was, A for alpha. And I think in later years, it's become this pejorative term. Everyone must be a much more a campaigning leader or a human leader. And there's those types that I've interviewed in the pod and also, put in the book. But I think there are instances where alphas are still absolutely successful. I mean, look at Silicon Valley. It's full of alpha leaders. The leaders over there, they metaphorically bang their fist on the table. They have more power than the likes of Philip Green, who you would associate with the alpha type in the UK, more power than he could ever dream of. So I think there are, and I think also coming out of something like the pandemic, if you've got an alpha leader is very decisive, very firm, they know their own mind, they might not be listening to everyone around them, they do get stuff done. And I think there's also evidence that they can be that figurehead. Sometimes these more modern types of leader say, and this is always an excuse if they don't want to be interviewed by me, they might say, well, it's not about me, James, it's about the team. It's guff. It's about, there's one person in charge. They get the big bucks. They've got to stand up and be counted. And the alpha has absolutely no problem about that. There can be a bit abrasive with it. They probably have got the biggest yacht and they will insist on the biggest office. Yeah. So, but, they have their place.
There were a lot in radio, and I worked for a few of them. There was one I didn't work for, but apparently he had a sign above his desk that just said, fit in or F off. So I don't know if that was a good leadership slogan or not.
And did you?
No, I didn't work for him. So I don't know. Not that one. No, I did work for some pretty interesting characters, but I didn't work for that one that had that particular sign. I only heard about it.
One famous, and I'm sure you know him. I mean, the famous John Myers, who
yes, I worked for John Myers.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, he was running. Which stations did he go into? I think it was
Century.
Century
was one of the. It was actually, I worked for two of the Century stations, but one of them was after they'd sold it. But I worked for the Century in the Northeast when it was owned by Border Television when John owned it. Yeah.
And John famously sacked the religious affairs broadcaster by saying, "You're out because not even God is listening." I think.
Yeah, it's great. It's a TV show. It's called Blood on the Carpet, and
that's it. That's
John,
the one.
But John was a terrific guy, and he sent me a really nice note when I won the Sony Award, and he was one of a kind, John. And but there are others that I've worked for as well who were interesting characters, and a lot of the time it was best to just stay out of their way. It was just the key.
This might not be the time, but I remember interviewing John. I was at one of the Scottish papers, and he was with Guardian Media Group, and they just bought Scott FM, 20 odd million, and I called him up, and I interviewed him going through McDonald's drive-through. That was his celebration for landing the deal.
Wow, yeah, that was a good bug. Apparently, he had a right run-in with, I think it was Kelvin McKenzie. But he had a right run-in with someone that he was telling me about once, who was a newspaper guy. Pretty sure it was Kelvin. But, So who's the best leader you've ever actually worked for?
Well, I think in newspapers, look, I've been really lucky to work for two of the best editors on Fleet Street. I think Paul Dacre, John Witherow are exactly the best thing you can say about both of them is they know their product, they know their readers. And so, Dacre at the Mail and John at the Sunday Times, and now the Daily, the Times. This is why they're very, very strong products, I think. I mean, you look at other titles in the market. I mean, think about how many times the Daily Express has flip-flopped. Is it left wing? Is it right wing? Is it for the North? Is it for the South? That's why it lost all its readers. It's about being consistent and actually having that long-term relationship. So, I think they would be, and obviously I was quite junior in some of those roles in some of those times. So you don't see them every day. You might hear them, but you sure know how things percolate through the newsroom, how the sense of how things are being put together. So I think that's an example of good leadership.
What, it's that everybody in the team knows really what the title stands for and what's expected of them without the boss having to tell them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah. So in general, what makes a great leader?
I think we're at this point now where, think about coming out of the pandemic. I think it's the leaders who I think they're very close to their workforce. I think actually these attributes that weren't particularly in vogue a long time ago. I think a good leader today is someone that can listen. I think they understand things like loyalty. I think they treat people to some degree how they want to be treated. And I think they're also quite thoughtful about, what leadership, what it should stand for. I think they're very good at justifying their own existence. So why am I sat in this corner office, whether metaphorically or actually, and what do I bring to the organization? Because let's face it, so many of these big multinationals, the production line in the factory carries on regardless of what the CEO says. The marketing campaigns happen, business carries on and on. So I think these really thoughtful leaders are the ones that how do I make a difference? What are the projects that I bless? Who do I bring up through the ranks? That sort of thing. So so that type I call the human leader, and they're kind of the antithesis of the superhuman alpha. But I think they are good, and they've had a good crisis. They've realised the leaders. I think these leaders who will prosper from this point onwards are the ones. They weren't the ones that were worried when everyone went off home to work, and they were worried that their workforce was all just feet up on the desk, watching YouTube, eating biscuits all day. They're the CEOs that switched around and actually realized that it was pretty tough working from home if you're a 20-something living in a rabbit hutch or whatever. And they embraced this idea of duty of care.
Yeah.
So, and I think, and they should be the ones that get rewarded with the loyalty coming out the back of this. We hear this a lot of time when I interview leaders. They say, "Oh, well, this millennial workforce, they all want to know about purpose and what you stand for as an organization." And I absolutely, okay, fine. They know them better than I do. I believe it. I absolutely buy that. I think they also want to get a good salary, but I think if the workforce and I think there's quite a lot of choice about where you work now. I think they do want to be looked after. They do want some purpose, and I think they do remember they have long memories.
Yeah. They want to feel valued, don't they? That's just a human thing. One of the best quotes I heard about leadership supposedly came from Napoleon Bonaparte, but it's so long ago. Who knows if this is even real? You may know this one, and apparently Napoleon said, "The leader's role is to define reality, then give hope." And I kind of like that one. Because
I hadn't heard that. That sounds pretty good.
If somebody says, look, this is the way it is. We're not in first place, but they give you they define the reality, or we are in first place, but we're not going to stay along if we keep doing this. And then followed by, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
I actually think that's a real simplistic way of looking at it, but I really like that one. Don't know if it's true, but it is attributed to him.
Yeah, but by definition, you're only a leader if you've got followers. So
yes.
I think actually you do have to bring in that dose of reality, but at the same time encourage people along. And I think the successful leader knows how to frame the challenge, the opportunity, the purpose, and then tell the workforce, tell the volunteer force for a lot of the charity bosses I interview, how they're going to get from A to B.
Yeah.
So yeah, that seems. I
them.
think Napoleon still got it.
He's still got it. He's still got it. No, I look at, I'm a Liverpool fan, so I think one of the greatest leaders of all time is Bill Shankly. And, so many quotes from him. And they all kind of do fit into that, define reality and give hope. Are great leaders born or trained?
Well, I think they're usually trained. I think there are some instances, I have this book with these 9 types in it, and obviously some of them are born. I have a chapter called Scions. This is kind of a chapter in defense of nepotism. These poor chaps who were born into a family, and the dad has already set up a big multinational company that one day, sadly, they're going to have to run. Poor them, small violin. So they are obviously born into it. And actually, if you look at that class, and there might be Rothschilds or Botines who run Santander, or someone like the Warburton family in making bread. There's lots of examples of scions that do succeed generation after generation. So there's a particular there's sort of particular characteristics they have. But I think a lot of the time it's training. And I think the best I did something that gathered together a few thoughts, because what I've always been interested in is who's the boss. How do they get there? How do they stay there? Methods of motivation. So some of the stuff we're talking about. And so you draw that right back. So what did they do when they were 15 or 20? And I think what they didn't do generally is they don't have a plan. They don't set out with a piece of paper saying, I must be a CEO by the time I'm 40 or 50. They're generally the people who just launch into life. They're probably above average intelligent, and they just do things they enjoy. And then I think that is one of the secrets. If you're doing something that you're really passionate about, then you have much better chance of rising to the top.
Mm. Does the Peter Principle, though, create a glut of bad leaders? Because I know I've literally found myself in leadership roles just because I was the one that had the most experience in the radio station, and then all of a sudden I'm the program director. And a lot of the times I didn't even seek it out. And then when you get, the first couple of times it happened, I didn't know what to do. And I just wonder if there needs to be more training done before putting someone into a leadership position.
Well, I think generally companies haven't been that good at mid-career training, on-the-job training, and lifting people up. And there's figures about what the we all it's been talked about at the moment now with the CBI. How do we get up UK's productivity? How do we invest more in R&D? And when we think of research and development, we always think about how do we get this new this brilliant new invention from the science lab in the University of Oxford, and how do we sell this to the Americans and the Chinese and so on. And actually we forget about the D, which is development, which is bringing on your processors and investing in plant, and actually bringing on your people at all levels of the organization. So I think longevity in itself shouldn't be the thing that gets you into the top job. I'm sure you did very well, Graham.
Eventually I did, but obviously my first couple of goes at it, a couple of radio stations I ran, I know I made a lot of mistakes, but then later on everything as a program director, it was great. The big problem I had usually was managing up. And that was, if I worked for someone who I knew was an idiot, when I say that, I mean that with the greatest respect. Often people in radio who have come from a sales background, which is a really important part of commercial radio, probably the most important part, some of those people end up in jobs where they are in charge of people from the programming side of the business. And it's very difficult to communicate with them because I know they don't know anything, but they don't know I don't know anything because they don't know, and this is, where the problems start.
But I think there's something, I've identified this type called sellers, and there's some on the podcast and some in the book. And I think it's really interesting what discipline people come up through an organization from and then make it into the leader. And I think the ones that are so there's so many people have come up through sales and marketing. So what was it about? Well, take Tim Davie, now running the BBC, of course, in his formative years. He was selling body spray at Procter & Gamble.
Yeah.
He helped rebrand Pepsi. And so on. And I think the way that these people come out of, whether it's the sales function or operational or finance, they're the ones that are, have their eyes open, not just to the outside world, but also to other disciplines. They're the ones that look to get other experience in other disciplines. They go sideways or whatever. They're also the ones that are, leaders get a lot of luck as well.
Yeah. I've worked for some very poor leaders. I've worked for one in particular, I'm sure, as a sociopath. But I've also worked for some fantastic leaders who have just been brilliant. One of them was Duncan Campbell, who is now in charge of the Australian Radio Network, which is one of the biggest radio networks in Australia. But he was the regional program director when I was at 2CR, when it was the GWR group. And that was very early on for me as a program director. And he did a brilliant thing. He said to me, he says, there are certain things that you're going to have to check with me first before you go ahead and do them. But if someone in the team asks you a question like that and you've got to check with me, don't say I've got to check with Duncan. Just say leave it with me, because they have to know that you're the boss. I thought that was pretty good. Well, and then he was replaced by another guy who was not a great leader. And he said the absolute opposite to me. He said, make sure you tell them you've got to check with me. Well, I think he was just more insecure than Duncan was, but Duncan was fabulous.
But there are huge, that leads to huge inefficiencies, doesn't it? Because every time someone at the top changes, then either everyone beneath them has to rethink and change their whole way of working, or else all the personnel changes. Yeah. And it takes 18 months, 2 years to settle everything down, and then the cycle starts again.
Yeah. I ended up leaving that one because of that situation, because of basically poor leadership. But yeah, it's interesting. And that managing up thing is sometimes... I found myself, whenever I got to these positions where it was a managing up situation, I just used to throw in the towel and leave and go somewhere else, because I just couldn't be bothered with it. I can remember there was a show at a radio station I was at. We did a show live from Downing Street, from in front of Number 10. And the presenter was still quite new to presenting. And I said to them, look, you're going to be outside Number 10. And they were challenging something that Theresa May had said. I said, when you say it, even if it's just an opinion, present it as if it's a fact and own it and don't back down. Knowing that was the right way to go. Well, within minutes of me having that talk, somebody more senior than me took him to one side and said, look, if you say anything controversial, make sure you say it's only your opinion and there are other... And I was like, what am I doing here? I just can't be bothered with it. Is there a way to push through that?
You mean for the underling or for over? I mean,
I couldn't see a way out.
I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure there is. But I think there's something about another category of leader who you see it in patterns when I look at CVs or interviewing people or whatever. People who've been exposed to the top brass early. It might be friends in high places thing, Graham. They seem to prosper. So there's quite a number of CEOs who got to the top after being what you might call chief of staff or chief bag carrier or whatever, or working in the office of. And
they were in that environment.
Yeah, I think when you're in that environment and you see how they effectively have that ready-made mentor. They see how they did it. They probably see from the top also how the organization works, because all these organizations, they have their own culture and things happen differently. I mean, someone I've just interviewed this week is the chap that runs Mars Pet Care. 85,000 staff. Everyone thinks Mars, by the way, chocolate and chewing gum.
Yeah.
Biggest division now is pet food and vet surgeries. Whiskers, pedigree. It's everyone got a dog in lockdown. So what I was interested in, he had a background selling chewing gum many years ago, but 21 years in Mars. So how do you navigate that organization, but versus any other? So it's really interesting, and it helps to know founding family or carry the bag of the CEO for a bit.
When you've been talking to these people in the podcast and when you've researched them for the book, have you found a common thread that runs through all of them? Like there is a silver bullet of leadership, or a thing that a thing that they keep returning to?
I think there's some of those threads about how they got there, about the not over planning too early. So someone like RJ Bangham from MasterCard, who's in the book but not the podcast. I mean, he all he wanted after university was to join a company that was good and that was global. I mean, that could have been something he invented later, but that he didn't really have much of a sense. I mean, what do we want when we're going? When we're graduating, we just go to a blue chip company. He joined Nestle, and it was very good for him. I think a lot of them increasingly talk about how they communicate. I had Kevin Ellis, who runs PwC in the UK. He's on the podcast, and it's 2 4-year terms, and he just got into his second 4-year term. And to run one of these big accounting firms, it's a vote. So democracy exists, and it's in accountancy. So all the partners vote for their favorite or least favorite, and he or she, usually a he still, becomes senior partner. And I said, well, here you are, Kevin, you're on the home run now. It's the second 4 years. And he said, James, look, the one thing I learned from the first 4 years is I was communicating, but nobody was listening. So I quite like that honesty, and that's good, because he didn't need to say it like that. But he said, look, I've just got to communicate more and better. That's my challenge for the second 4-year term. So not the breakup of the big four and all the other things that are going on in that industry right now. It's how do I get my message across and make sure that my people understand me. And you do hear that quite a lot about how the boss is communicating now.
And who have been the greatest leaders in history then? Because we hear a lot about Churchill, and there's probably a few Romans. And there's maybe Napoleon.
Well, aren't we living in a great time of political leadership now, Graham?
I don't know if we have. In my lifetime, I don't know if we have lived in a time of great political leadership. I don't know. You find out after the fact, don't you? You don't find out when you're in it. Right now.
No, I don't think you do. I mean, we say this vaccination program is Boris Johnson's Falklands moment, but I'm sure there's a few other banana skins before he goes to the ballot box again. I think the thing with it's so much of it is perception, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the way that the leaders now, particularly on the business side, they're running bigger organizations, they're more complex. It's not just about, there's so many metrics, so it's not just about delivering profit and getting the share price up. It's how happy are your staff, and have you saved the planet? So all of these different things. So I think any outgoing leader can probably grab at least one KPI, one statistic that they've said they've done well on. I think actually coming out with reputation enhanced, company improved is very, very difficult. So you can say, I mean, who are great leaders? Who's a great corporate leader at the moment? Someone like Jeff Bezos at Amazon.
Yeah.
But he's also, as I'm sure a lot of the political leaders are, he's also a very divisive character.
Yeah.
But if you think about what, if all that Bezos had done is create the world's biggest seller of books, and that's where he was sat today, when he stepped back to do all his other things like space travel and so on, we'd probably be able to say, wow, what a fantastic leader. But the fact that he's gone from books to video to audio to groceries to all of these different things, I mean, I think it's immense, really. So, but obviously a very divisive character. I interviewed Adam Newman, who was the first CEO of WeWork, and he actually did liken the WeWork vision, which, let's face it, is temporary office space, to kind of a conquering Roman Empire, emperor type strategy. I couldn't quite see the parallels, but I certainly wrote it down.
And it was working for him, so yeah, you can't knock it. You can't argue with success.
it was definitely working for him. I always like to interview the Messiah because it's great copy or great audio. I think it's easier that's easier in print.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking of leaders, and this may be slightly off topic, the BBC's in a bit of bother at the minute. What with the Bashir thing? What should Tim Davie do as a leader right now, do you think?
I think as well. We just talked about Tim, and I think I'm a big fan of the BBC, and I think it is really it's peak BBC, as some people say on social media, isn't it? This is the BBC kind of flogging itself a little bit after a huge cock up many years ago. I think what you shouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, this is something that affects news and current affairs, and it's 25 years ago, and I don't think it should be a stick to flog the whole of the BBC to cut the license fee into ribbons. I think there are things that you can do around editorial standards, but really it's very difficult to correct something that happened 25 years ago. I think already the standards are better. They've been forced to be better, by the way the media has gone, and they've already got oversight from Ofcom. So I think Tim needs to engage with everyone and try and allay everyone's fears, including the royal family. But I'm not sure a huge amount needs to change. What do you think?
I don't know. Well, I've worked at very low level BBC. I've worked in BBC local radio, and what always amazed me is when people go the BBC, and I would work at like BBC Radio Derby, and that would be like nothing like BBC Radio Merseyside, and that would be like nothing like BBC Radio London. Each had their own cultures and often their own way of doing things, even though a lot of them would say this is the BBC way, and I would know it's not, because I worked at another station a couple of weeks ago, literally, because I freelanced for a little while on a lot of BBC stations, and I don't think you can have a thing describe something as the BBC. Now, obviously, when you get to the higher levels and the national networks and stuff, maybe so. But at the level I was at, I thought it was silly to call something the BBC. I mean, there were definite overall standards, and you had to hold people to account, and you had to have enough sources, and they had to be credible sources, and all the rest of it, which is basically good journalism. But I didn't find that there was any. I did find each BBC every BBC radio station I worked really was unique in its own way. It served its local community. So I don't know how much of the BBC, when people talk about the BBC, I'm not sure what they're talking about.
No, I mean, I think I know people there who always almost imagine that different programs, and in the same way that you talk about Derby, Manchester and Leeds, are different, almost like different brands, different titles on a magazine stand or a news rack. And Panorama would have nothing to do with the Today programme, which would have very little to do with the 6 o'clock. Exactly, they're all different things. Now I know it's all been pushed together, and they're sharing resource a bit more than they used to. But yeah, they are all very, very distinct. So,
and they're run by people. And if you have people who don't play the game, and I'm not suggesting anybody did here or not, but people are being alleged to have not played the game, and people are being alleged to have not checked on things and whatever, but you're dealing with different people, and you might end up with some people who aren't maybe suitable for those roles. That's going to happen in any massive organisation, just the same as the NHS or the National Trust. And I know you've interviewed somebody from the National Trust who made that point that they're all but they're run by people. They're not run by this huge monolithic power. They're run by people, and you do get people who are not brilliant.
Yeah, and I think I focus so much on the boss, and of course they say it's not me, it's about the team. But I think there's something to be said about who appoints the boss, how the boss is chosen, how the boss is held to task, whether
and the
that's
culture
by
usually
trustees.
The culture in that particular part of each organisation is usually it comes from the top. It does. The culture can't come from below, really. It usually comes from the top.
Yeah, I think so. Although, I mean, what struck me as interesting, which I've been able to do much more with a podcast than in print, is really go from business into leaders who are in charity, art, sport, healthcare, and so on. And I think with I'm very interested in charity leaders, and I think there's a lot that charities and corporates can learn from each other. But the charity leader has to. I think a lot of the culture does come from within the organisation. So take National Trust. I mean, they don't open the doors of those stately homes and all that coastline and so on every day without thousands and thousands of volunteers.
Yeah.
Working for nothing. So I think you have to, as a leader there, you can set strategy and talk about the finances. And Hilary McGrady, who I interviewed recently, was very thoughtful about what she learned from the pandemic. But you really have to listen to all of these people who show up every day because they love it.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned the book earlier. So which came first, the book or the podcast?
Well, the podcast came first. So I worked for myself for about 5 years, and the great thing about being a journalist at Sunday Times, particularly Evening Standard, is you hopefully get this skill. Well, you need to find this skill. So as city editor, anything can happen in the city. You've got to be able to write 300 words convincingly on any city topic before first edition, which is great. So you get what I hope is a breadth of knowledge, and that served me very well. But as someone working for themselves, I thought it was helpful to dive into something. And I thought, well, what do I like? What do I know? I like the bosses. I'm interested in the people. So I thought that leadership, I can dive into this huge sea of leadership. I want to write a book on leadership. They take a long, long, long time to get to fruition. And I thought I can really get into this area with the podcast. Because as you know, you need, some kit and some willing participants. So I launched into the podcast 2 years ago with an aim of going beyond business into these other areas, getting leaders from different areas together to compare notes. And off I went from there.
And how far will you take it? Will you go to political leaders? Like, given the chance, would you do, I don't know, Putin?
Well, I think he'd be listened to, Graham. So yeah, I mean that would be that. I can't see that one happening. But I mean the one I did, which is more out of my zone than usual, was I was really pleased recently to interview Mike Wigston, who runs the Royal Air Force.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that was really good because, all of these leaders have big responsibilities, whether they're running stately homes or cancer charities or whatever. But this is a guy who's defending the UK. So it's really, really serious stuff.
Yeah.
And he has cultural challenges to deal with. And also he's thinking about technology a lot. He's thinking about how he modernizes. So how does he bring on the next generation of talent, and at the same time he's got to commit to unmanned planes because he wants one fighter pilot in the center with 6 unmanned planes around the edge, all the drones working off the human guy. And it was very refreshing. He said, look, I think I said to him, isn't it wonderful that you were a fighter pilot by the age of 23 and you've patrolled the no-fly zones in Basra and so on, and then you've come up through the organization over 35 years and everybody respects you for it. And actually, he said, James, it really is a lot of nonsense. We need to modernize. The fact is we're still choosing our leaders based on their hand-eye coordination when they were 20-somethings. And there must be better ways than this. So who knows? The next leader might not be have done their tours of duty. There may be someone who's been in the back office.
So the bloke in charge of the RAF was saying that someone who works in the stores now has got just as much chance of being a great leader of the RAF as someone who flies a fighter plane. Is that what he was saying?
He was saying that, I think he was saying that you don't necessarily need to have the same experience that he's got to be the next CEO. I mean, that hand-eye coordination as a 20 gets you into the fast jet.
To have the respect of the people that are below you, though, don't you? You must have to have a bit of a track record, I would have thought.
I think so, but then I suppose if you extrapolate that to other industries, I mean, it's a bit like you said in radio. I mean, just because you've done drive time or breakfast,
Yeah,
does that mean that you're the next station controller?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And that's
And
fast. And you do need fast hand-eye coordination at breakfast.
exactly. And let's not forget the Pope gives marriage guidance. So, yeah, maybe we shouldn't go there with that one.
So I think, how far will I take it? I will keep. I'm 65 CEOs in on the podcast,
Yeah.
and it's a huge range, and I'll keep going, pairs or one at once, and yes, see where we get. I think there's always interesting conversations to be had. The first one I did, I've got two people together, and it was all purely down to the diary, because you know what it's like getting one CEO in a room. You get two, it's even harder. So I got the senior partner from Deloitte and Kate Collins, who runs the Teenage Cancer Trust. Good brand, good charity. And I think they both sat in the room with the headphones on and the microphone thinking, what on earth am I doing with him? And the great thing was, as soon as they start talking, they've both got the same challenge with people, strategy, how they use their time, all of that stuff. So I think I'll just keep, digging this furrow.
Why did you decide that as well, to have two? Because a lot of them, it's two people rather than one.
Well, I road tested the idea first of all with a chap called Paul Geddes, who's a friend who was running Direct Line at the time, and he was he featured in the podcast early on, and we had a chat about it. I didn't realize he was quite a podcast fanatic, and he had all these on his phone. And he said, "Look, James, so many of these podcasts, they're one-on-one. It's one host. There's a theme. They talk about whether it's holidays or like the Desert Island Disc format or whatever. Why don't you try 2-on-1?" And I thought, brilliant, Paul. Yeah, that's good. And it has proved to be good when the diary works, when you can get people together, because much of these pre-lockdown were recorded in the Soho studio. So it really was. You got a great conversation with the eye contact, and I think CEOs like to meet other CEOs. They don't do it as much as we all assume. So I think, from having been in the media, I know that there's always appetite to try new things out and meet them. So I did 2-on-1. Yeah, so it was down to a bit of market research with Paul, and then in lockdown I've done a few ones. I mean, I think this world is so interesting, and it's also a world just to keep experimenting with.
And which podcasts inspire you?
That I listen to?
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed, because I wrote my book. I did another one before it, so I enjoy some of the writing podcasts. So I like one called Always Take Notes, which is presented by Simon A. Cam and Rachel Lloyd. I think, and they do. It's kind of grounded in journalism and writing, but they go right across. They've had people like Tim Rice on there. They recently had Johnny Geller, the author's agent. So it's people from different aspects of writing and journalism and media. So I found that quite interesting. And then there's a load more, but I've gone blank. I like some of the Economist ones. That might be a bit might sound a bit dry. Yeah. I'll get my phone and find some more, Graham.
There's no particular interview podcasts you like? You don't like the Mark Maron and the Adam Carollas and the ones?
I do like some of the. I do like some of the Mark Maron. There's some of the ones on NPR that I've listened to, and I forget the presenter's name. Do you know what? Because
Ira
of the time,
is it Ira Glass? This American Life?
It's not.
Okay.
It's not. I've sampled some of these really big name ones, and then I've tried to find something a bit different. The one I'm trying to think of, I can't think of the host name, but it was a really good interview with the two founders of Patreon.
Right. Okay.
And so on. Do you know, because of the time I spend in a for example, in a print setup when I'm interviewing somebody, I think you get the best out of someone in sub 1 hour, say 50 minutes.
Yeah.
So I don't automatically go to these podcasts that are like an hour and 15, hour and a half.
Or Joe Rogan, which can be like 3 hours.
Yeah, I just don't commit.
Okay.
Don't commit as much. Maybe I should. I like what I'm just looking through some now. I like the Simon Mayo Books podcast.
Yeah.
What else? Bridges to the Future by the RSA. I like some of the New Yorker ones as well.
Yeah. It's interesting you should say 50 minutes because we're approaching 50 minutes right now.
There you go. You're going to get nothing else out of me.
It is a good time to wind this up. The podcast is called Leading with James Ashton. And the book, you've got the book there, haven't you?
I've got the book here. Of
Look
course,
at
the
that.
book is never far away. The 9 Types of Leader.
And it's interesting that the podcast came first and then the book. A lot of people, it would have gone the other way. So this is showing that podcasting is using its forces for the good and not for evil.
I think the great thing about the podcast was it was an opportunity to experiment and get some interviews under my belt in a different format, and it's so instant. The publishing industry is still quite a gradual and slow process.
Yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you. And Leading with James Ashton is on the Pod 20. I present that on Podcast Radio every Friday at 5 o'clock, and then across the weekend it's repeated. So check that out. And where can we find out more about you?
Yeah, well, my website is jamesashton.co, or on Twitter at Mr. James Ashton, and all about the podcast is leadingpod.com.
James, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Graham.